Hello once again, everyone. So recently I've been doing a couple classes that I've been focusing on thrusts, and so I thought I'd do a little video going over some basic thrusts with the longsword. Regardless of system, these will all be great. They're just some thrusts that you should know and that you can implement pretty quickly. So first and foremost, our simplest thrust is going to be just basically shooting out a Zornhau slash just any sort of cut into a thrust from our right shoulder. So normally we talk about striking with this, and then sometimes you'll have mentioned we'll fall short and then can deliver that thrust, but you can also learn to launch that thrust as an initial action. So what's going to happen here is rather than cutting, oh no, I'm at a distance, then repowering, if I'm already intent upon throwing it as a thrust, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shoot it out a little bit lower. So normally I would cut for head, and when it falls short, I would then repower, that cut having its own finishing point. This time I'm going to shoot it out a little bit more directly, so I'm going to boom, and I'm really putting a little bit more emphasis on that tip sort of doing this motion. Now, I'm not drastically putting my hands up. What that'll lead to is I'll hit target, my sword will pop out of my hand, and I'll look kind of foolish. Instead, I'm going to focus on driving down past where my cut would ordinarily land into center line, which is good cutting habit anyway, down through, and with the intent to place usually in the collarbone, which, speaking of which, anytime you're launching thrusts, you want to be going for about this gorget area, not just because there's more protection there and it's safer, even Bob's got a gorget on because we want to be safe. It's also because aiming at the mask, you have two kind of not great probabilities. If you have a spatulated tip, oftentimes you'll catch the mask and then skip off. If you have a thrusting tip, you don't skip off, but if you hit the head in just the right way, you can end up craning someone's neck back. That's been a decent problem recently. So in general, I try not to aim my thrust for the head, not due to, any sort of them saying not to historically, but more out of niceness. And plus, if I aim for center mass, aim small, miss small, aim for his gorget, miss, I hit his shoulder, I hit his chest, maybe I do hit his head. So it's just a better target overall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend out. I'm going to focus on getting my tip on the target, and at the same time, I'm just going to pass forward. And you notice how my tip arrives before my sword, but I'm not shortening my cut. It's a very important difference to make sure you're doing, because especially when you're trying to do this, you can end up accidentally shortening your cut on reflex, which would look more like this, which is where I go. That's not particularly useful, as in that moment, what I'm basically doing is moving into a very weak guard. I've just taken my offensive tempo, which shows my opponent, hey, I'm going to attack you. He's twitchy, ready to go. He's going to take that tempo and hit me. So instead, I want to really make sure that I extend out to my maximum, and that by the time my tip is in presence, my right foot is coming forward, and it's all one synchronous action. So that's just a basic thrust from your right shoulder. Now you can take this thrust and change it a little bit to turn to what I call the snap thrust, which is going to be slightly different. So you'll see this a lot in competitive HEMA, where people will be standing right foot forward in this sort of modern common fencing posture. They'll move the sword onto their right shoulder and hold it in the thumb grip. Now, this usually is seen as an indicator of, hey, I'm about to try and zwerk you or something along those lines. But one of the more common things you'll see is that they'll move into this thumb grip, and then from here, they'll pull on the pommel and shoot that point out. Now, what's nice about this, and I wish I could show you in dramatic slow motion, is that when I do that, my tip actually flexes over, like so, and will more often than not bend around someone's crossguard, strike target, and it almost becomes a bit like a Prellhau, the flat strike, which is kind of cool. But this one, like I said, you'll see it a lot. Someone will be moving, they'll pop, and then they just shoot that guy out. Now, what's particularly annoying about this thrust in regards to dealing with it is because, like I said, it will curve over crossguards. It comes out very quickly, and if you're in zwerk mode, then your defense is usually going to be to move across like this relatively narrowly, which this thrust just destroys. Plus, if someone does set aside this thrust to this side, I'm still in the thumb grip. It's not too hard for me to execute a Zwerkau from there or other nasty things. So once again, you just place your thumb on the blade. You can also do this left foot forward with a passing step or without, but more often than not, if you watch competitive footage, they will be standing right foot forward. I'm just going to pull on the pommel, push out, and extend my arms, hit, and oftentimes you'll also see this with a left pass following that initial contact. Because once the sword point is in there, your foot motion doesn't necessarily matter. Historically, the blade would go through sometimes, which I believe would lead more often to people either stopping themselves, or if you're going to go all the way through, go ahead and take Absetzen's advice and slam that guard into their chest / neck / whatever you thrust through. So bear in mind that often in drills, we'll touch and we'll stay about here, but when you throw it for realsies, people are running away from you, and you may end up passing forward, and that's okay. Your point's already in them, and it can be kind of nice to alleviate some pressure on them, as the swords do flex, but they don't flex that much. Now, on that same note, similar to this, but a little different, is going to be the Schildhau. Now, the Schildhau is a master strike, but more often than not, it terminates in a thrust, though it can be a cut. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to push my blade across like I'm doing an Oberlo. But now, just before my sword would touch your sword, I'm going to stick my thumb forward and turn my sword over. Now, I'm not turning it flat. I'm turning it to about a 45-degree right here. Now, what this does is it can set aside a strong thrust coming from Flug and other techniques like that, but we're going to worry about it just as a thrust for now, as it is a particularly good one. So I'm going to stand in Vantag, I'm going to pop it out. In that case, I missed and went over his shoulder, that's okay, right? Pop, and I'll land that point, right? Now, you'll notice that when I make contact, I'll end up basically in left ox, with my thumb to the inside and the crossguard going into 45. This kind of leads to this sort of flex going on. It's a very, very nice thrust to land because, one, it is a master strike. It's useful against both the Oberlo and against Flug, two very common techniques. And it'll take a little bit of practice to learn to throw just right, since you've got to learn to do that transition. You can also just launch this from the thumb grip, but that will be a little more obvious, so bear that in mind. But one more time, here's the Schildhau. So I'm just going to extend, step in, and strike my target. Now just a few more thrusts. Next one we're going to talk about is going to be the Absetzen, which can be done either from Flug to ox, from Flug to Flug, or from ox to ox. Absetzen meaning setting aside. Now, the ox to ox one is probably the least common. We're not going to worry about that one for right now. It's still a useful one to learn, but all the principles you'll learn from the one I'm about to describe, you can just apply there and figure it out on your own. But when it comes to Flug to ox, which is the most common one you're going to see, what's going to happen is you'll notice that my sword is currently at about a 45. As a strike or thrust comes in, or even if I'm going initially, I'm going to power this out. I'm going to turn my hands over, so now my sword is at a 45 going inward. As this continues, I can either terminate in Flug with my step and end up in Langenort, or if I so choose, especially if a cut is coming in, I can turn it up and in. Now, really important thing with this, I'm not curling myself up. This has no circular motion to it at all. In fact, I don't even like using circular terminology when it comes to going up to ox like this, because more often than not, it turns people into doing this stuff, which is not very good. So instead, watch where the schilt goes. At no point do I curl. Instead, I'm going to push it basically in a diagonal straight line from where it started to where it finishes, and I should end up here. So here's that again. Push out. Now you notice that I'm really extending with my arms before my leg comes into play. That's important, as more often than not, if someone sets me aside right here, I haven't committed my body. I have not brought myself any closer to my opponent yet, which is good because our opponents are trying to hit us. So out here, if something goes wrong, I can always go no, return to center, no, leave with a cut, something along those lines. Versus if I start this and immediately throw my body in, I will not have the strength and angle necessary to apply that force that I just built up. So, really important thing, if your Absetzens aren't working, you may be stepping too soon, and thus your tip is getting pushed off this way, as opposed to driving it across. Then I put my leg in as I'm actually executing the hit and the push upward. So, here's that one again at more regular speed. And I knocked Bob off his dolly. How about that? Now, that one is pretty good. As for executing it going up into ox versus other positions, you can also execute it going into Flug without too much difficulty. That one's a little more rare. Usually with that, what will happen is someone is coming in with a thrust of their own, and you will set it aside and deliver your thrust on that low line. That's also particularly nice, but more often than not, when you see this launched as a purely offensive technique, it will be going up into aux. Now, the next thrust we're going to talk about goes from low to middle. Now, when it comes to executing this thrust, this one's going to be a little different. So we're going to go ahead and take the guard of Ober. Also, this can be known as Mezza Porta di Ferro, middle iron gate. So my sword is essentially straight down at the floor, and depending upon what source you're studying, it may be straight line, it may be kicked off to the side, it may be more held to the side, doesn't really matter. Personally, I like to hold it. The ball of my pommel is just in front of my left hip bone. My right leg is forward. Okay? You can also hold it this way, doesn't actually matter, but this way is more often the way you're going to want to do it. Now, from here, most people are going to be utilizing the little hand taker, the little snap cut, but you also have a particularly nice thrust if you want to use it. So what I'm going to do here is my sword is low, I'm going to raise like I was cutting, but rather than letting my lead hand hinge, which gives my tip momentum so I can take the hands, instead I'm going to engage and lift with my lats. So I'm going to pop this up, so both my arms just kind of come up as one piece. I'm going to pop up, and at the same time I'm going to step forward. Now, that one glanced off as gorget. Good thing we had that gorget on, hey Bob? But just pop up, and it should hit relatively straight. Now, you'll notice my hands are a little bit lower, and that the flex actually forced my hands back into me. That's because this thrust is usually one that's actually best done in armor. You can still do it out of armor very easily, but it's an excellent thrust for hitting someone in armor because this goes to the straight center line and can be directed to any of our 4 primary targets. So primary targets in armor when it comes to thrust, right? We've got the neck/face, we've got the armpit on the left, we've got the armpit on the right, my left, my right, and then we've got the unarmored crotch, right? If I want to, with the same thrust, I can hit into neck, I can hit into armpit, I can hit into other armpit, though that one is a little riskier. It will occasionally glance off, but sometimes you can get caught into their pauldron, which is kind of nice. Or I can hit down below the belt, all without any difficulty and no telegraphing showing which direction I'm going to go. This thrust also is decently far-reaching. It's kind of surprising. I don't bring my other leg up, but because my arms are straightening, I'm getting essentially the same amount I would get out of a cut. Now, employing this one in a unarmored context, it's going to be a little less useful just because your arms are going to be a bit more exposed. The trick I find is it's best used if you have gone low and someone is thinking about using an Oberlo technique, a technique that beats low to high, basically. So this is usually best done against people who are either holding up high or they're thinking about it, but they're cagey. In that tempo, rather than trying to take their hands, which is probably what they're thinking about, so we're at that edgy distance, they're kind of hovering, just pop that guy forward. Now, the second you hit, you're going to be in a ton of danger from their cut coming back down. So, in armor, go ahead and keep going. You don't have much to worry about. But in regards to loss, what I recommend you do is up, and notice how I'm moving more off to the side following this attack. You can also, if you think you can, right? So I'm from here, I hit, I'm going to go ahead and let my arms raise off of that, and I end up in this very familiar position that we've seen before. So both of these are just fine options. It's a very easy thrust, very low energy. And I'll show that from the front real quick. So I'm here, and all I'm going to do is just in. So sword, foot. These are all fantastic thrusts. I recommend that you use them because they're great. They're very simple to do, like I said, and they'll kind of lead into you doing other thrusts. None of them are too complicated either, nor do they come from necessarily... The only one that really comes from system specific is going to be the Schielhau. Even the Absetzen, that property is pretty much a universal sword thing. The idea of setting aside / creating an overbind or an angle, that appears in everything. But if you utilize these couple thrusts, thrusts will seem a lot more approachable, they'll seem a lot more useful, and these are all great techniques to use. But otherwise, thank you very much, Bob, and we will go over some other techniques another time.